This is chapter 28, part 2 of the reproductive system lectures. So today we're talking about the first part of the female reproductive system. So overall, the female reproductive organs are going to include the ovaries, which are the female gonads, the uterine, or also called fallopian tubes, the uterus, the vagina, the vulva, and the mammary glands. And we're going to talk about some of these in this part of the lecture. So functionally, the female reproductive system is going to have 5 main jobs. The first is going to be that the ovaries are going to produce those secondary oocytes, those eggs, essentially, and then as well as hormones. And this is going to include the production of progesterone as well as estrogen, which are both female sex hormones. This is also going to include the production of the hormones inhibin and relaxin. The second function for the female reproductive system is going to be the uterine tubes, or the fallopian tubes, are going to transport a secondary oocyte to the uterus, and this is going to be normally where the site of fertilization is going to occur. So where the egg and the sperm are going to meet, and the sperm is going to fertilize that egg, that's all going to happen in the fallopian tubes, or the uterine tubes. The uterus is going to be the site of implantation for that fertilized ovum, and it's also going to be where the development of the fetus during pregnancy and labor is going to take place. The vagina is going to be responsible for receiving the penis during sexual intercourse, and is also a pathway for childbirth. And then the mammary glands are responsible for synthesizing, secreting, and ejecting milk for the nourishment of that newborn baby. So all of this is very focused on basically on childbirth, on reproduction, growing new humans, essentially. So the ovaries are going to be the female gonads, and this is going to look like a pair of almonds, about the same size and shape as a pair of almonds. The book says a pair of unshelled almonds, although I don't know that I would know what an unshelled almond, or what a shelled almond looked like, an almond with its shell still on. So we're just going to say they look about the size and shape of almonds. These ovaries are going to be homologous to the testes. This is where, in this instance, we're using the phrase homologous to mean that 2 organs are going to have the same embryonic origin. So starting off, whether, before it's determined which way things are going to develop, the tissues are going to be the same in the embryo, and then are going to either develop into ovaries or testes, depending on the genetics of the human being produced or developing. The ovaries are going to be responsible for producing gametes. In this instance, in the case of ovaries, the gametes that are produced are secondary oocytes that are going to develop into a mature ova, or eggs, and this is after fertilization occurs. The ovaries are also responsible for producing hormones, and these, like we mentioned, are going to be progesterone and estrogen, those female sex hormones, as well as inhibin and relaxin. The ovaries are going to be on either side of the uterus, and they're going to descend from the brim of the superior portion of the pelvic cavity during about the 3rd month of development, in embryonic development. A series of different ligaments are all going to hold these ovaries in position in the body, or in the pelvic cavity. The broad ligament of the uterus is going to hold the parietal perineum, and this is going to attach to the ovaries by a double-layered fold of the peritoneum called the mesovarium. And then the ovarian ligament is also going to anchor those ovaries to the uterus, and the suspensory ligament is also going to attach them to the pelvic wall. So all of these things are going to kind of keep them from just sort of floating around in free space in the pelvic cavity. It's going to keep them anchored to wherever it is they're supposed to be. Each ovary is going to contain a hilum, and this is going to be the point of entrance and exit for the various blood vessels and nerves along the mesovarium, along which the mesovarium, is going to be attached to. So, histologically, the ovaries are going to consist of several different layers or tissues, I guess. For starters, we have our germinal epithelium. This is going to cover the outer surface of the ovary, and it's not really highlighted here, or labeled here. Next is the tunica albuginea, which you can see here. This is this lower layer down here. This is going to be the capsule of dense, irregular connective tissue that's going to be found just below the germinal epithelium. Next is the ovarian cortex, which you can see here. This is going to be below the tunica albuginea, and it's going to consist of our ovarian follicles, so our developing oocytes essentially, as well as some stromal cells. And then in the very middle of our ovary is going to be the ovarian medulla, and this is going to be where we find the connective tissue, the blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves that are going to be responsible for supplying those ovaries. The ovaries are also going to have something called ovarian follicles, and this is where this is going to contain the oocytes that are going to be in various stages of development, as well as the follicular cells and the granulosa cells. Then there's also something called a mature or a Graafian follicle, and this is something that's ready to rupture and is going to expel that secondary oocyte. And we'll look at another image of this in a minute here. And then additionally, there's also something called a corpus luteum, and this is going to develop after ovulation from that empty follicle. And this is going to be responsible for producing progesterone, estrogen, inhibin, and relaxin. And this is going to be responsible for the production of a lot of hormones that would be used in order to support a fertilized egg until the placenta can form. So, looking at the whole process of oogenesis and follicular development, and this is a really important kind of process to be aware of. During early fetal development, these primordial germ cells are going to migrate from the yolk sac to the ovaries, just like what we saw in the testes of males for the beginnings of sperm. So just like that. Once these primordial cells have migrated, the germ cells are going to differentiate within those ovaries into something called oogonia. These oogonia are going to be diploid stem cells that are going to divide mitotically to produce millions of these little germ cells, these oogonia. So even before birth occurs, though, most of these germ cells are going to degenerate, and this whole process of degeneration is called atresia. So a few of these oogonia are going to develop into larger cells that are called primary oocytes. These are going to enter prophase of meiosis 1 during fetal development, but they're not going to complete that phase until after puberty has happened or has begun. During these arrested stages of development, so before puberty occurs, each primary oocyte is going to be surrounded by a single layer of flat follicular cells, and then an entire structure, this whole entire structure is going to be known as the primordial follicle. The ovarian cortex that's surrounding the primordial follicles is going to consist of collagen fibers and fibroblast like cells called stromal cells. So at birth, approximately 200,000 to 200 million primary oocytes are going to remain in each ovary. Of these, about 40,000 are going to be present at puberty, and then around 400 of them or so are going to mature and ovulate during a woman's reproductive lifetime. So the remainder of those primary oocytes are actually going to undergo atresia. So each month after puberty started and until menopause hits, those gonadotropins, the follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, are going to be secreted by that anterior pituitary, and this is going to lead to the further stimulation of the development of several of those primordial follicles. So although you only need one, and although usually only one is primordial follicle is going to typically reach maturity that you would need for ovulation to occur. There are going to be several that are going to undergo the process of development. They're just not all going to make it. With a few odd exceptions of, like, say, when someone has twins. This is a case when two of those primary follicles have reached fully developed, full maturity, and they both are released when you ovulate. This would be a case, if they were both fertilized, this would be a case when you'd end up with fraternal twins. So a few of those primordial follicles are going to start to grow, and they're going to develop into primary follicles. I should mention, though, that most of the time, vast majority of the time, only one of these primary follicles is going to make it to maturity. So anyhow, a few of those primordial follicles are going to start to grow, and they're going to develop into primary follicles. Each primary follicle is going to consist of a primary oocyte that's going to be surrounded by a later stage of development, by several layers of cuboidal and low columnar cells that are called granulosa cells. All right. The outermost granulosa cell is going to rest on the basement membrane, and then as the primary follicle grows, it's going to form a clear sort of glycoprotein layer around it. It's called the zona pellucida, and this is going to be between the primary oocyte and the granulosa cells. So you can see that in this little image here, this like kind of dark purple line with our granulosa cells all around it, and then our zona pellucida right there. So in addition, stromal cells that are surrounding the basement membrane are going to begin to form an organized layer called the theca folliculi. Right? So with this continuing maturation, a primary follicle is going to develop into a secondary follicle. So in the secondary follicle, the theca is going to differentiate into two specific layers. We've got our theca interna and our theca externa. The theca interna is a highly vascularized internal layer of these cuboidal secretory cells that are going to be responsible for secreting androgens. And then the theca externa is that outer layer of stromal cells and collagen fibers. So just two different layers that are going to be contrived from that one original layer. So in addition, the granulosa cells are going to begin to secrete follicular fluids, which you can see here. And this is going to build up in a cavity that's called the antrum. And this is going to be found in the center of our secondary follicle. The innermost layer of the granulosa cells are going to become firmly attached to the zona pellucida, and this is going to now be called the corona radiata. So a radiating crown, if you were going to translate that. The secondary follicle is going to eventually become larger, and it's going to turn into a mature or a Graafian follicle. Right? While in this follicle and just before ovulation, the diploid primary oocytes are going to complete meiosis 1, and this is going to lead to the production of two haploid cells of unequal size, each of which is going to contain 23 chromosomes. So the smaller cell that's produced by meiosis 1 is going to be called the first polar body, and this is basically just a packet of discarded nuclear material. The larger cell, though, that is going to result from this meiosis 1 is going to be called the secondary oocyte, and this is the one that's going to receive most of the cytoplasm from that cell division. Once a secondary oocyte is formed, it's going to begin meiosis 2, and but then it's going to stop in metaphase. The mature or Graafian follicle is going to soon then rupture, and this is going to release that secondary oocyte. And this is the whole process that's known as ovulation, is that rupture and release of our secondary oocyte. You can kind of see it here, our secondary follicle. It's kind of cool looking. So we made it this far looking at the whole process of follicular development and oogenesis, the production of oocytes. So looking here, we have a really nice, handy sort of play-by-play, like a little graphical representation of this whole process. And this is an important process. So at ovulation, the secondary oocyte is going to be expelled into the pelvic cavity together with that first polar body and the corona radiata. Normally, these cells are going to get swept into the uterine tubes, aka the fallopian tubes, and if fertilization does not occur, then these cells are going to degenerate fairly quickly. If sperm is present, however, then and one of them is able to penetrate that secondary oocyte, which would again take place in the uterine tubes. Once this penetration occurs, meiosis II will resume. The secondary oocyte is going to split into two haploid cells, and again, these are going to be unequal in size. The larger cell is called the ovum, and this is going to be the mature egg. And then the smaller one is the second polar body. So the nuclei of those sperm cell and the ovum are then going to unite and are going to form our diploid zygote. It is important to mention also that if the first polar body undergoes another division to produce two polar bodies, then the primary oocyte ultimately is basically going to give rise to three haploid polar bodies, all of which are going to degenerate, and then one single haploid ovum, which is what you really need for the whole fertilization thing to occur. So, therefore, one primary oocyte is going to give rise to a single gamete, in this case, our ovum. This is an interesting contrast to what we would see in males, where one primary spermatocyte is going to produce 4 gametes. So that's an interesting, comparison or contrast there between the males and the females. Sorry, technical difficulties. So here we have a very nice and very elegant summary of both follicular development and oogenesis. All right, these two things are going to be inherently linked. You can't really, you need to know them both and how they interact and go together, essentially. So this is an important infographic here, important figure. So that's all that we have for the ovaries, and as well as oogenesis and follicular development. Moving on then to the uterine tubes, also called the fallopian tubes. Females are going to have 2 uterine tubes, and these are going to extend from the uterus all the way to the ovaries. These are the tubes. These tubes are going to be the pathway for sperm to reach that ovum and for the secondary oocyte and fertilized ova to travel to the uterus. The end of the tubes is called the infundibulum, which you can see over here. This is our infundibulum. And at the end of this infundibulum are going to be these fimbriae, and these are going to be these goofy, crazy-looking finger-like projections that are going to project from the infundibulum. And one of which is going to be attached to the lateral end of the ovaries. All right, so you can see that here. Our fimbriae. The ampulla is going to be the widest portion, which you can see here, of the uterine tubes, and then the isthmus of the uterine tube is going to be the more medial, sort of short, narrow, thick-walled portion of the uterine tubes that's going to join up with the actual uterus itself. As far as the histology for these uterine tubes, there are going to be 3 layers. There's going to be the mucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa. The simple ciliated columnar epithelium is going to make up the mucosa, and this is going to contain cilia that are going to help to move that fertilized ovum or that secondary oocyte towards the uterus. This is also going to contain something called PEG cells. These are non-ciliated cells with microvilli that are in the tubes that are there to secrete fluids that are going to help to nourish and support that ovum. Those are our PEG cells, which you can see kind of here. So we've got our ciliated columnar epithelium of the mucosa with our cilia, and then our non-ciliated PEG cells. These are going to have microvilli. So the next layer, the middle layer, is called the muscularis, and this is going to be composed of an inner, thick, circular ring of smooth muscle, as well as an outer, thin region of longitudinal muscle, moving it so it's going to be in two directions here. And this is going to help to produce that peristaltic contractions of the muscularis, as well as the ciliary action that we see in the mucosa. These two things combined are going to help to move those oocytes, or that fertilized ovum, down towards the uterus. And then last but not least, our outermost layer of the uterine tube is going to be the serosa, and this is just simply a serous membrane that's going to kind of wrap around it all. All right. So after ovulation, local currents are going to be produced by the movements of those little fimbriae, those little finger-like projections at the end of the uterine tubes. These are going to surround the surface of that mature follicle just before ovulation occurs. These currents are going to help to sweep that ovulated secondary oocyte into the perineal cavity, or from that perineal cavity into the uterine tubes. A sperm cell is usually going to encounter and fertilize a secondary oocyte somewhere in the ampulla of the uterine tube, and although fertilization in the perineal cavity is not terribly uncommon, so fertilization can occur up to 24 hours after ovulation has occurred. So you've got a 24-hour window there after that egg has been released. So some hours after fertilization, that nuclear material of our haploid ovum and our sperm are going to unite, and then this is going to result in a diploid fertilized ovum, which we now call a zygote. And this is going to be when that zygote is going to begin to undergo cell division while it's going to work on that journey down towards the uterus. It takes about 6 or 7 days for that zygote to arrive in the uterus after ovulation has occurred, and then by this time any unfertilized secondary oocytes are going to have disintegrated. The uterus is going to also be part of the pathway for sperm to be deposited in the vagina, sperm that are deposited in the vagina to reach those uterine tubes. The top of the uterus is called the fundus, which you can see we've got labeled up here. This is one of those things that they feel for when you're pregnant to see. They measure, from the pelvic area to the top of the fundus to see how big baby is. And then the central portion of the uterus is called the body. The inferior extension of into the vagina is called the cervix, and then the isthmus is going to be between the body and the cervix of the body of the uterus and then the cervix. So the uterus is going to be where that fertilized ovum is going to implant. And then during reproductive cycles, when implantation does not occur, the uterus is also going to be the source of menstrual flow. So this is going to be where your period, any kind of period blood is going to come from, essentially. Sorry. So the uterus is also going to be divided into different regions. The interior of the body of the uterus is called the uterine cavity, and the interior of the cervix is called the cervical canal, and then the opening of the canal into the uterus is called the internal os, and then on the other side of that, the opening of the canal, of the uterine canal into the vagina, or the cervical canal, into the vagina is called the external os. And you can see all of those here. So here we have our external os, the isthmus of the uterus, and then our internal os, where this is going to be the opening of that cervical canal into the uterus. So there, just like with the ovaries, there are going to be several ligaments that are associated with the uterus. And these ligaments are going to either be extensions of the parietal peritoneum, or they are going to be fibromuscular cords that are there to maintain the position of the actual uterus itself. So the paired broad ligaments are going to be double folds of peritoneum that are going to be attached to the uterus on either side of the pelvic cavity. And then the paired uterosacral ligaments are also going to be peritoneal extensions, and these are going to lie on either side of the rectum and are going to connect the uterus to the sacrum. The cardinal ligaments, also called the lateral cervical ligaments, are going to be located inferior to the base of the broad ligaments, and these are going to extend from the pelvic wall to the cervix and the vagina. And then the round ligaments are going to be bands of fibrous connective tissue that are going to be between the layers of the broad ligaments. And these are going to extend from a point on the uterus that's just inferior to those uterine tubes all the way to the portion of the labia majora of the external genitalia. If you've ever been pregnant or known anybody that's been pregnant, they can sometimes experience a round ligament pain. This is just general like soreness or sometimes sharp little stabby feelings that are going to result from pressure that's being put on the uterus by the increasing and ever-growing weight of that baby, and that's going to cause round ligament pain a lot of the times. This is just uncomfortable, but generally pretty normal. So, as far as the histology of the uterus is concerned, again, we have 3 layers of the uterus. All right, the outermost layer is going to be the perimetrium. This is also called the serosa. Then we have the myometrium. This is the middle layer, and this is going to consist of 3 layers of smooth muscle. And then, last but not least, we have the endometrium, and this is the inner layer of the uterus. It's going to have a stratum functionalis layer. It's going to be shed each month during menstruation, and then the stratum basalis layer is going to be a permanent layer, and this is what's going to give rise to the new stratum functionalis after each menstruation has occurred. So this is what's responsible for basically this stratum functionalis is essentially the layer of the endometrium that you're shedding each month when you get your period and menstruate. So looking again at some more histology, we have the outer layer, the perimetrium, like we mentioned, or the serosa, and this is going to be part of the visceral peritoneum, and it's going to be composed of a simple squamous epithelium, as well as some areolar connective tissue. Laterally, it's going to become part of the broad ligaments, and then anteriorly, it's going to cover that urinary bladder, and it's going to form a shallow pouch. Called the vesicouterine pouch. So posteriorly, it's going to cover the rectum, and it's going to also form a deep pouch between the uterus and the urinary bladder, called the rectouterine pouch, or also called the pouch of Douglas. I don't know who Douglas was that he had the unfortunate luck of getting his name assigned to this particular pouch, but I guess, he's marked down in history forevermore. But anyhow, so the pouch of Douglas, or the rectouterine pouch, this is going to be the most inferior point of the pelvic cavity. And here we can see those two pouches. Here we've got our vesicouterine pouch, and then our rectouterine pouch up there, or our pouch of Douglas. So, looking at the actual histology of the uterus, we've got our middle layer of the uterus, our myometrium, and this is going to consist of 3 layers of smooth muscle fibers that are going to be thickest at the fundus, and then they're going to be the thinnest at the cervix. The thicker middle layer is going to be the circular layer, and then the inner and outer layers of the myometrium are going to be the longitudinal or oblique layers of smooth muscle there. So during labor and childbirth, there's going to be coordinated contractions of this whole myometrium together in response to the presence of oxytocin that's secreted, that's released from the posterior pituitary, and this is going to help to expel that fetus from the uterus. So these contractions are what's responsible basically for squeezing baby on out. Our innermost layer of the uterus is the endometrium, and this is going to be a highly vascularized layer, lots and lots of blood vessels, and there are going to be 3 layers to this uterine layer, to the endometrium. So our innermost layer is going to be composed of simple columnar epithelium. These are ciliated secretory cells, and these are going to line the lumen of the uterus. Underlying that, so here we've got our ciliated simple columnar cells. Underlying that, we have our endometrial stroma. This is going to be, you can see this here, this is going to be a very thick region of lamina propria. This is, remember from previous lectures, this is just areolar connective tissue. And then our endometrial glands, our uterine glands, these are going to develop as little invaginations. Here we can see our endometrial, our uterine glands. These are going to develop as invaginations of the lumen, of that luminal epithelium, and it's going to extend through most of the myometrium. The endometrium is going to be divided into 2 layers. The stratum functionalis is our kind of more superficial layer. This is the functional layer, and this is going to line the uterine cavity, and this is going to slough off during menstruation. And then the deeper layer is the stratum basale, which we can see down here. This is our basal layer. And this is going to be a permanent layer that's responsible for producing and giving rise to a new stratum functionalis after each menstrual cycle has occurred. So we shed this stratum functionalis, and then our stratum basale is going to produce new cells that are then going to become the new stratum functionalis. So, looking at the uterine blood supply. This is fairly extensive, and it's very important because this is what's going to help to keep everything happy and, conducive to growing a small human. So branches of the internal iliac artery are called uterine arterioles, and these are going to supply blood to the uterus. The uterine artery is also going to give rise to the accruate arteries, and these are going to feed the myometrium. And then these branches, this is going to branch in, these accruate arteries are going to branch into radial arteries that are going to go deeper into the myometrium. And then straight arterioles are going to be responsible for supplying blood to the stratum basale. So, last but not least, to look at cervical mucus. And this is actually a really interesting kind of part of the female anatomy, of the female reproductive system. The secretory cells of that mucosa of the cervix are going to produce cervical mucus. And this is just quite simply going to be a mixture of water, glycoproteins, serum-type proteins, as well as lipids and enzymes, and other kinds of inorganic salts. So when this is thin, this is going to be more receptive to sperm, and when it's thick, it's going to form a cervical plug that's going to form as a physical impediment to sperm penetration. So it's going to kind of help to keep the sperms out of the uterus to prevent, during times when the female is not fertile. That cervical mucus is also going to supplement the energy needs for those sperms when they are able to so that they are able to potentially fertilize that ovum. And then both the cervix and the mucus is going to also serve as a sperm reservoir. These are going to help to protect the sperm from the hostile environment that you would have in the vagina, and it also protects the sperm from phagocytosis, so being basically gobbled up and cleared out by any sort of wandering sort of phagocytic cells that would be there to keep things clean and tidy. So the cervix and this mucus is also going to play a role in capacitation. So a series of, this is going to be So this capacitation, this is going to be a series of functional changes that the sperm has to undergo once it gets into the female reproductive tract before they're able to actually fertilize that secondary oocyte. So capacitation is going to cause the sperm cell's tail to beat more rapidly, more vigorously, so that it can swim faster. And it is also going to prepare the sperm cell's plasma membrane so that it's able to fuse with the oocyte's plasma membrane so that fertilization can actually occur. So that's our cervical mucus. And that is all that we have for this particular lecture today. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, please feel free to get in touch.